Hello everyone, and welcome to this one is on civil rights, and so let's go and get started right into it. Really and truly, when we start talking civil rights, we really should start right after the Civil War with the Reconstruction era. We get what's known as the Reconstruction Amendments are passed, the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendment. Now, the 13th Amendment ends slavery. However, in order for the 13th Amendment to even be possible, remember Abraham Lincoln, during the Civil War, passed what was called the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, while that didn't free any slave specifically, but it gave the Union Army the right, as it marched into the South, to free slaves by declaring them contraband. But the issue was, once the war comes to an end, the Emancipation Proclamation was a Wars Power Act. Would those free slaves, in fact, be forced to return back to the South as slaves? So Lincoln worked hard in his last few months of his life to try and get the 13th Amendment passed on the basis of the Emancipation Proclamation. Of course, also, this doesn't apply to people who are incarcerated in prison. Remember that. There is a little clause to that. The 14th Amendment, which gives people born in the United States the right of citizenship. Now, of course, they were thinking immediately for those freed slaves who are now free men and women. But it always brings about some unintended consequences, right? First off, we know that a few decades later, we have a Supreme Court case, Won Kim Ark versus the United States. Did the 14th Amendment apply to all people, especially the Chinese? Well, yes, it does. And so the 14th Amendment becomes a very powerful amendment. We also know that throughout the Gilded Age, corporations began to use the 14th Amendment as well to protect them. For instance, the 14th Amendment tells us that the state cannot deny you the right to life and liberty and property without due process of law, which is a mirror of the Fifth Amendment. It says the same thing in the Fifth Amendment, although the Fifth Amendment says that the federal government can't do that. Well, what is a corporation but a group of individuals? So this idea of protection of property without due process of law emerges with the 14th Amendment. So that's another unintended consequence. The 15th Amendment, well, once you're an American citizen, you should actually have the right then to exercise your right of a citizen and vote. Of course, the one thing that was a complaint about the 15th Amendment, it made no reference to gender. So women were not given the right to vote with the 15th Amendment. That would come decades later with the 19th Amendment. All right, but as soon as Reconstruction started and you went up freeing 4 million souls from bondage, well, what do you do next? Remember, these are individuals who had never really been taught how to live in society. So the Republican Party eventually creates this thing called the Free Man's Bureau. A lot of Northerners will come to the South through this organization to try and help rebuild the South and help educate former slaves and find them places to work. The South didn't like these individuals, referred to them as carpetbaggers. Remember, these are individuals coming down from the North into the South to try to help, but the Southerners obviously disliked this. Andrew Johnson is President of the United States after Lincoln's assassination, a racist. He will try to get rid of the Free Man's Bureau and try to undermine everything that the radical Republicans are trying to do to help. Eventually, he will be impeached over this. Of course, the South, they weren't ready really to change the way that they had lived for hundreds of years, and so eventually, black codes will be developed in all the southern states, a way to try and force these individuals to stay on the farm, to stay working, to continually supply them a stable labor force. Eventually, sharecropping emerges. And if you remember, you get a situation where here you still have a white plantation owner. He might have 400 acres of land. So he'll go to 3 or 4 different black farmers and tell them, I will rent you several acres of my land. And I know you can't afford to pay me, so what you will do is you will share your crop with me. Once your crop grows, you give me a portion of that crop as payment for the land. And these farmers agree to this. Well, then these farmers then realize they don't have money to buy seed, farming equipment, so they go to the local store owner who will allow them on credit to take seed, farming equipment, maybe get a cow or a mule or an ox, maybe even get a worker or two to help them. And again, tell them, all I need from you is for you to share a portion of your crop with me. So when it's time for harvest time, the black farmer shared a portion with the white landowner. He shared a portion of it with the white store owner, and then barely had enough crop left over to feed his family. Never enough really to get himself out of debt. So every year he would have to start over and over and over again. So this was a perpetual cycle of a form of slavery. Also during this time period, the rise of the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, a lot of hatred, a lot of violence obviously perpetrated towards black citizens in the United States and the South. It's President Ulysses S. Grant who will declare them actually rebels and use the U.S. Army to go after them, and eventually by the 1880s basically crushes them in the South. Hiram Revels, you might remember, our first black man elected to Congress from the state of Mississippi. A lot of black men decided to join the U.S. Army, but in this time period they were segregated, and it's the Apache Indians that give them the nickname Buffalo Soldiers. And for decades, black forces in the U.S. Army were collectively known as Buffalo Soldiers. Also, a lot of them decided not to participate in farming and went further west into Arizona and to Texas, where there was ranching going on, and they worked as cowboys. Nearly 25% of all cowboys at this time period were in fact African American. As we go through the Gilded Age, civil rights becomes a major issue, and two leaders eventually emerge, but both of them have completely different views. Booker T. Washington, who basically becomes the voice of black America in the South, he will accept this thing we call segregation, segregating the races. If, in fact, the white South will allow blacks to self-rely, they'll allow them to create their own economic capabilities. Booker T. Washington wanted black men to learn basic mechanical skills. He developed mechanical schools. His famous is Tuskegee in Alabama, teaching them basic farming equipment, mechanical things, and practical sciences is what he felt was more important. His famous Atlanta Exposition speech, that's the one where he famously says, "Cast down your buckets where you are," and he's speaking to the white South. Don't turn towards the immigrant that you do not know. Come to the black community and the black man that you do know and use them for your labor force. Of course, W.E.B. Du Bois had a completely different idea. He wanted immediate civil rights, which is only natural if you think about it. And he and Booker T did not see eye to eye on this issue. He will be one of the co-founders of the organization known as the NAACP. Now, I've asked you guys many times what does that stand for, so I'm not going to say it here. Hopefully you'll just know it. Ida B. Wells, I throw her up here. If you notice, I've had her in a few of our reviews now because I want to distinguish her from Ida Tarbell. Ida Tarbell was the muckraker who took on Standard Oil. Ida B. Wells is the black activist, female, who tried to get anti-lynching bills passed. A lot of lynching is going to take place during this time period, and she has a famous pamphlet called Southern Horrors. Of course, by the end of the Gilded Age, we get the Supreme Court case Plessy versus Ferguson. This is the law that establishes the idea that separate but equal is the law now. And from this emerged what is called Jim Crow law. Jim Crow law is something that really happens here towards the very end of the Gilded Age, beginning of the Progressive Era. They really don't start using this expression until about 1901, Jim Crow laws. This idea that not only can you separate, in this case with Plessy, he had gotten on a trolley car. And because it was a privately owned company, they had a right to decide where people sat because it was their property. But this now began to embed itself in all areas of Southern life, grocery stores and public buildings. You'd have separate entrances for white and black, separate water fountains. Everything was separated and segregated in the South now because of this law. The civil rights movement perhaps gets its biggest boost during World War II. You are going to war against the fascists and the Nazis, and you realize just how terrible they are, especially as more and more information comes out about Nuremberg laws and how the Germans were treating Jewish people in Germany and throughout Europe. Well, the idea, well, you have to stop that horrible situation. Well, Black America believed the same thing, but they also felt like, well, but what's going on here with Jim Crow laws? So you have two organizations developed, CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, and Double V, which meant victory in Europe over fascism and victory at home over Jim Crow. FDR, right, if you remember, he calls on all industry. We have to start preparing. We become the arsenal of democracy, building battleships and planes and tanks and bullets, oh my. But we come to find out that a lot of these industries were not hiring black workers. So along comes an individual, A. Philip Randolph. A. Philip Randolph, he was the union leader of a union called the Brotherhood of the Sleeping Car Porters. He tries to get audience with FDR to talk about this, and FDR won't meet with him. So A. Philip Randolph threatens a march on Washington. FDR immediately remembers 1932, the Bonus Army incident. And when they marched on Washington, he doesn't want another Bonus Army situation. So he immediately passes Executive Order 8802. We get the Fair Employment Practice Commission, the FEPC, the Fair Employment Practice Commission, which starts to tell businesses, if you're going to get a government contract to build anything for the war effort, you must have fair employment practices. You must hire minorities. In this case, obviously African Americans. Well, after the war, Truman's now president. He's getting ready for the election of 1948, and one of the things he actually becomes concerned with is civil rights. So he commissions Congress to take a look at the matter of civil rights, and a report is filed. It's called To Secure These Rights. This is an official report from Congress that basically states that civil rights in America really is bad. And so Truman issues two executive orders, 9980, 9981. In 9980, he ends discrimination practices within federal jobs. In the federal workplace, you cannot discriminate at all. And 9981 is the integration of the U.S. Armed Forces. No longer can we have segregated troops. We have to integrate white and black into the same U.S. military. Of course, the biggest advancement for civil rights comes under the presidency of Dwight Eisenhower. You have the Supreme Court decision, Brown versus School Board of Topeka, Kansas. This is the Warren Court, if you remember, Earl Warren. They overthrow Plessy versus Ferguson in public schools. Now remember, this case dealt with public school system. You cannot segregate. Separate but equal is not constitutional. And so they order the integration of schools, public schools. But in 10 years, from 1954 to 1964, less than 5% of African American students were actually attending white schools. In the South, you have a massive resistance, is what they called it, and the advent of the private school begins to happen. And it's not until, and we'll mention this in a few moments, LBJ in the Great Society, that we start to see more and more integration of public school systems. Of course, other facets of life as well have got to be addressed. After the Brown decision, it reinvigorates the civil rights movement. You get the famous Montgomery bus boycott. This dealt with Rosa Parks. Of course, Joanne Robinson, also somebody should always be remembered. She was the leader of the Women's Political Council that helped organize a lot of this. She's also the one that reached out to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to join this cause. His nonviolent civil disobedience is what he practiced. He was a great admirer of Henry David Thoreau from the Transcendentalist movement. He also noted that Gandhi himself practiced nonviolent civil disobedience. And of course, Jesus Christ. His organization was the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. CORE is still around. It's the one organization that stayed after World War II, Congress of Racial Equality. But we have another organization as well, collectively called SNCC. People called it SNCC, SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committees. Mostly in the beginning, they organized massive sit-in protests at places, especially at restaurants and lunch counters. that would refuse to serve black people. Of course, there was a more militant side as well to the civil rights movement. Malcolm X, Nation of Islam, they saw things in a much more different view, that if there was going to be violence, then the black community had every right to protect itself and fight back. And of course, there were a lot of followers of Nation of Islam, Black Panthers, Huey Newton, Bobby Seale. They started in Oakland, California. They were in response to the brutal practices of the Oakland police, and they began to fight back the what they felt, honestly, were the racist tendencies of the Oakland police, and eventually Black Panther units are formed throughout California. Stokely Carmichael eventually becomes the leader of SNCC, and it turned from a nonviolent thing to a little bit more on the violent side. Carmichael began to practice what he called Black Power, and he eventually joins up himself with the Black Panthers. And we get basically the height of the civil rights movement in the 1960s. James Meredith, the first black man to attend the University of Mississippi. That was extremely historical. Freedom Riders were groups of college students, both black and white, who had crisscrossed the South and rented Greyhound buses, practicing sit-ins and such. And on May 14th, 1961, when a Greyhound bus came into Montgomery, Alabama, it will be firebombed, basically, by what may have been off-duty police officers. Of course, when Lyndon Johnson becomes president, that's when we get really the height of civil rights movements. We get the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and one of the most important pieces of law that this thing creates is the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which we still have to this day. If you have a job, you must sign this piece of paper. It tells us that no one's allowed to deny people the right to work based on race, color, religion, ethnicity, gender, and even sexual preference today. The 24th Amendment also passed while Johnson is president that ended poll tax. You can't force people to pay a tax in order to vote. We get the Freedom Summer of 1964 as a result, trying to crisscross the South again to get as many blacks registered to vote as possible. And then the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which ended literary tests in order to be able to vote. And the last real bloody moment of the civil rights movement is March 7th, 1965, the March on Selma. Between Selma and Montgomery, Alabama. They were simply a peaceful march trying to, first of all, someone had been killed, so there was a protest for that, but they're also going to register people to vote. And the police of Alabama on this day came out in force and beat them. There were 3 marches in all, and finally by the 3rd march, Johnson sent in federal troops in order to protect the march. And so basically that's it for the little quick history here of the civil rights. Don't forget, on Edmodo, I'm going to be uploading the video log that you will need to use to turn this in for Tuesday. All right, enjoy what's left of the weekend.